Hello, everyone. Welcome back to On Point Politics. And today I'm going to be going over Donald Trump's best case scenario for the 2024 presidential election and how Donald Trump could basically outperform expectations once again, like he's done in 2016 and in 2020, and achieve an electoral college landslide like the one that Obama had against Mitt Romney in 2012. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please like the video. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share with a friend so we can keep this channel out on the algorithm. I really appreciate the support on the previous videos that we've had for the past couple of weeks, for the past week, excuse me. I really do appreciate it. The channel's been growing like crazy, and I hope to get a 1K subscribers by the end of the month. We're probably going to get there before the end of the month, to be completely honest. We're probably going to get there in like 2 weeks at the rate that we're going, but if we could at least get there by the end of the month, that would be great. And without further ado, guys, here we go. So Donald Trump, right? Clearly in my election prediction, I do have it with Trump winning 286 to 252 electoral votes. I have him winning Wisconsin, North Carolina, Nevada, and Georgia, with Pennsylvania, but losing Michigan and Arizona, because those states are very left trending. And I think regardless of, Biden's rating, I think he's still gonna have a pretty substantial base behind him, because that's just how the Democrats are. And so I do think that more than likely, if Trump were to have a landslide scenario, this is probably what I would see it like. I do think that he'd win Alaska by over 10. I think he'd win Iowa and Ohio by 15 points in a best case scenario. I also think that Florida would be over a 10-point win in a best case scenario. I think he'd probably win it by like 12 or 13 points in a best case scenario. I think he'd basically win Miami-Dade by 10. He kind of max out his margins in the panhandle. He'd do pretty good in certain areas. If you look at Florida here, it was only Biden only won it by like 6 or 7 points in 2020. So I think Trump would basically flip that on its head. If he were to win the state by 10, he'd win Palm Beach County, regain Pinellas. He'd probably flip Hillsborough. He'd also win this county as well, get Orange County way closer, win Duval County. He'd probably win Leon County as well, and kind of max out his panhandle margins. That's probably what you'd be looking at there. North Carolina, I think, would be a state that would vote by a 5 or 6 point margin if he were to win it in a best case scenario. I think he'd max out a lot of these margins. He'd do a lot better here. He'd get these a lot closer. He'd probably win this county. He'd probably get Mecklenburg County a lot closer. He'd kind of eat into the margins, over here. He'd start, improving here as well. And I think he'd probably get about five. I think his rural turnout would just explode in a best case scenario. And I think that, in a best case scenario, he would win Texas by like 8 or 9 points. He'd basically recreate his 2016 victory, but he'd do it mostly through the southern border. He'd probably flip a lot of these counties at that point. He'd get these really close. He'd get Houston County a lot closer, or not Houston County, I'm sorry, Harris County. He'd possibly even have a shot at flipping it in a best case scenario. He'd definitely flip Williamson County for sure. He'd flip the Tarrant County as well. So he'd do really well there. He'd mostly win with a lot of Tejano voters. He'd probably expand his base with those. And he'd probably recreate his 2016 victory. He'd probably win by 8 or 9 points there. And I think in a best case scenario, he does win Wisconsin by about like 5 points. I think he'd basically, all of these counties up here would essentially become deep red. He'd basically, like, not max out, but he'd do pretty good in the wow counties, and he'd get a lot of these blue counties. He'd win Sauk County, he'd win Greene County, he'd win Rock County at that point, he'd win La Crosse County probably. And more than likely, he'd also win Portage County too. This one would be a little bit closer, but I think he'd win Douglas County as well. Almost all the counties on the map would effectively be Republican, except for like this county over here, and Dane County would still be pretty blue as well. But mostly the whole state would be red at that point, and so I think he'd win it by about 5 or 6 points in a best case scenario. It'd be similar to North Carolina. No, actually, we're gonna make Colorado closer. as well as New Mexico. We're going to touch those in a second. Actually, I shouldn't even make Illinois and New York probably a little bit closer than 10 points in this best case scenario. So I think the next state that he would actually win by a likely margin still would be Georgia. If you look at the polling data, even for Wisconsin, it is tied, but usually this state has the worst polling data. And I think in a best case scenario, if he's winning the popular vote by 3 or 4 or even 5 points, this is probably what it would be. This best case scenario is basically assuming that he wins by like 4 or 5 points nationwide, which I mean, he was polling at 3.5 the other week. The polls have gotten closer, but he was polling at 3.5 the other week. So I feel like, if he's winning over 50% of the vote, and some of the third party votes are eating at Biden, he could win the popular vote by 4 or 5 points in a best case scenario. So this is where this is basically coming from. So I do think that he would win Georgia by about actually 7 or 8 points in a best case scenario. I think he'd win it more than Wisconsin, because I feel like in a best case scenario, the state would trend way to the right even more than Wisconsin would. Cobb County would, all of these counties surrounding Atlanta would basically flip back. A lot of these counties would flip back. All of these, all red. All of these would become super deep red counties. He'd massively improve with the black vote. And by the way, in the best case scenario, I am assuming that he's getting about 35-40% of black voters, and he's also winning the Hispanic vote nationwide. He'd probably be winning the Hispanic vote by like possibly, we could say maybe like about 10 points in a best case scenario. That's probably what he's winning it by. So I do see him winning Georgia by 7 or 8 points. I think another state he'd also win in a best case scenario by quite a bit, by a likely margin, is Pennsylvania. I think he would do very well in Pennsylvania in a best case scenario. I think he'd max out all of this, T-shape area. I think he'd max out the west side. He'd eat into Erie. He'd win Erie County. He'd probably get Allegheny County really close, win Centura County. Dauphin County, I think, would flip. He'd massively overperform in the northeastern part of the state, win Scranton's area. He would win Lackawanna County, win Monroe County, win Northampton County. He'd win a lot of these counties, and he'd probably get Philadelphia within like 40-50 points. He'd do really good in Pennsylvania in a best case scenario. Another state that he would win by a likely margin in a best case scenario is in fact Michigan. I think he would win Michigan by about 7-8 points in a best case scenario. So yes, theoretically in his best case scenario, he does actually win Michigan more than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, because this is assuming that his fallout with the union workers and the fallout with the Muslim community would basically fall into effect in this best case scenario. In the real world scenario that I do have, I think he still wins Wisconsin and Pennsylvania more than Michigan. But I do think that in the best case scenario, Michigan would vote to the right of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in the best case scenario. And even if you look at the polling right now, the polling right now has Trump winning Michigan by 5 percentage points. He is, in the polling data, he is winning Michigan more than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. He is winning it by more, by a substantial amount. But do I think this is going to hold up? Probably not, but in a best case scenario that he does hold that up, I think he would win Michigan by a couple of points more than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Basically, all of the union support would pretty much go to Trump. He'd basically win Flint's County, he would win Genesee County, he'd win Kent County at that point. He'd get a lot of these a lot closer. These would basically become all deep red counties at that point. So I do think he would win it by about 7 or 8 points in a best case scenario. I think Arizona, on the other hand, this is the first lean state. I think he would win Arizona by about the same margin that he won it by in 2016, possibly 4 points in a best case scenario, because Arizona has massively trended to the left, and I think that Maricopa County will get even bluer in 2024. And so I think that is going to counteract him winning it by 7 or 8 points, possibly even that he could even win it more by. So I think in this scenario, I do see him winning it by about 4 points. So now he's at his, original electoral vote count from 2016. In a best case scenario, he wins Nevada by about 4.5 percentage points. I think he'd win it by about 4.5. Basically, all of these were to become deep red. This would become safe red. These would become likely margins, but I do think he only wins it by about like 4.5 points in a best case scenario. I do think for Biden, I think New Hampshire does actually go Democrat, or it does go Republican in a best case scenario for Donald Trump. I do think he would massively improve in a lot of these counties here. I think that the whole World War III narrative on Biden would really stick to voters in New Hampshire, and I think he'd probably win it by about 2 points in a best case scenario. I also think Nebraska's second district would vote in a best case scenario for Donald Trump. I think he would win it by about 3 percentage points. Virginia would be a state that would vote for Donald Trump by about like a point in a best case scenario. I think he would kind of recreate that Youngkin victory. He would get these really good victories, and a lot of the momentum, you've even seen in these special elections in Virginia that just happened yesterday, places where Trump won by 16 and 24 points. The Republican there was winning them by 50, 60 points in the special election. Now, they are special elections with very low turnout, but just because that is a humongous swing to the point where it's like, okay, Trump may not win it by 50 or 60, but he could win it by maybe 25, 35, 40 respectively. That could be a scenario where he does do a little bit better. And so if he gets those rural margins up and he does start making these likely Republican and he starts eating into these counties, you could see him recreating that Youngkin victory, especially with the message that Youngkin went in with grocery prices and things like that. I feel like Trump would win Virginia in a best case scenario. I also believe in a best case scenario, he would win Minnesota by about like 2 points. I think he does win Minnesota by about 2.5 points in a best case scenario. I think the Minneapolis base for Biden would just absolutely collapse in a best case scenario, and I think he would win it by, about 2.5 points. I also think that New Mexico would be that tilt Republican flip. I think he would win New Mexico in a best case scenario by just ever so slightly. His gains with Hispanic voters and him winning the Hispanic vote, I think would just barely put him over in the state. And now we have the last two states, Illinois and New York. In a best case scenario here, he actually would win New York and Illinois by more than New Mexico. And I'm going to explain why this would happen. With Hispanic voters, Trump had about 37, 38% of the vote, right? And so he would probably be hitting like 30, 53, 54%, maybe even a little bit below that, but he'd be winning them regardless. With black voters, he's straight up going from like 12% all the way up to 35, 40% in this scenario. And so if you do actually take that into consideration, he would actually win Illinois by about 3 points and win New York by about 3 or 4 points, especially with the governor's race in 2022, how the state just took an absolute turn to the right. It wouldn't really be that surprising to see him win New York and Illinois by a pretty significant amount and win it in the same column as Arizona and Nevada. I wouldn't be surprised if he did that in a best case scenario. I think he would basically continue the trends in the New York City area. I think he would massively improve in the Chicago area because despite what the Democrats think, a lot of black voters do not like illegal immigration. They just straight up don't like it, even more so than Hispanic voters. And I think if this is the best case scenario, I think Colorado would only be a 5 point win. I think Oregon would have to narrow up, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Connecticut would have to narrow up, and I think that Delaware would actually get down to a lean margin in a best case scenario. And possibly even Hawaii goes below 10 points in a best case scenario because of the whole Maui situation. I think that could be a factor into it. That could be a factor in that play, especially, over here in Maui County, he'd probably significantly overperform there. And so that is basically it for this video, guys. I do believe in a best case scenario, Donald Trump would get an ultimate landslide in the Electoral College and would win 392 to 146 in a best case scenario, especially if you're matching the polls from 2016 or 2020, excuse me, if you're matching the results from 2020 to these polls, you're basically looking at a 10-point shift nationwide. And the way this works, guys, is when the country shifts a certain amount of points, the states do not follow linearly with it. That just does not happen. And so because of that, I do think that Trump, when he wins the popular vote by 4 or 5 in a best case scenario, I think he would win New York. I think he would win Illinois. I think he does win Minnesota, Virginia, and New Hampshire. Now, I think Arizona would be very left trending, so I do still think that he probably would only win it by 4, 4.5. But this is the map that I see. The next video I'm going to do is talking about Biden's best case scenario for the 2024 presidential election, what his best case scenario looks like, and it nearly does not look the same as Trump's. Biden's ceiling is much lower than Donald Trump's hypothetical ceiling at this point in time. If you guys did enjoy the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with a friend so we can get the channel out on the algorithm. And I hope you guys have a good night. On Point